This could have been easily another episode on US politics, talking about the town hall interviews that both Biden and Trump have completed. But honestly, I want to bring it back home this week. You might think it's somewhat odd that a channel titled Watching the World UK has covered the US's COVID mistakes before, looking at the UK's COVID mistakes. And I'd be inclined to agree. So let's fix that this week. Let me start this by saying there are two of us that work on this channel. A fact that you would know if you watched the end of the credits or had looked at the About section in the channel. Both of us have seen this pandemic in two very different ways. I live in London, and for reasons that are obvious if you've watched our other videos, I can't really be put on forlorn leave, or furlough as it's more commonly called. Whereas my co-writer has been unemployed through all of this. We have two vastly different and insightful views into this crisis. Me from directly helping the healthcare industry stay afloat, and him from witnessing firsthand the uncertainty around jobs and the economy. We are going to use this insight to help you, the viewer, understand what happened in the UK and what in fact is still happening in the UK while we're in the middle of a second wave of Covid-19. My co-writer's exact words to me when he sent over the notes for this episode were, "I'm sorry if it's too long. Really don't know what more to say, given it's been very hard for me to find things that haven't been a failure or otherwise grossly insufficient." And honestly, that just about sums it up perfectly. The UK government's response to Covid-19 has been just short of terrible on all levels. They failed to implement the necessary protective measures soon enough, naively or otherwise placing the expectation of action onto the public, and once they were finally official and put into place, they were lifted much too soon, and the attempts to bring the virus back under control afterwards have fallen far short of their intentions. The track and trace system has utterly failed, with an app that large swaths of the public don't trust enough to even use. A failed curfew on pubs that cause people to simply congregate en masse in the streets or in the tube or any mass transit for that matter, all because the government is blissfully unaware of the logic behind staggering the closing times. And finally, the local measures that have proven nothing more than utterly confusing, with people spending far too long being unaware that their local restrictions are even there or what they were if they are there. At the start of this year, the British public watched Italy. We had cases of COVID at this point, but not really enough to worry about. If it was handled well, everything would be okay. So, we were watching Italy. Watching how a country came to a standstill to fight the virus. How hospitals were overrun, how people had dead bodies of relatives stuck inside their homes. All eyes were on Italy. Watched how this once beautiful country turned into effectively stock footage of apartment blocks. I worked with an Italian, a confident man who exhibited every single Italian stereotype that you would have in your mind right now. I watched how he turned into a panicked mess as he watched the COVID lines creep closer and closer to where his family lived. But we all watch people like that. We all cared for them, but we didn't believe that this would ever be a problem in the UK. All this time, cases were rising and rising and rising, and the UK government didn't act. I was actually in self-isolation at this point. One of my housemates had exhibited every symptom. But I remember the start very vividly, mostly because I had to survive on basically no food because all the supermarkets at the time were out of all the essentials, and I couldn't get a home delivery driver to bring me food because they were all booked up in my area, and in fact still are. This really should have been foreshadowing of logistics issues to come. Thankfully, my work offers sick pay, so I didn't have to worry too much about money. But let's say you're not me, and you don't get sick pay from your work, or worse yet, your work has been legally mandated to close, so you have no income from there. Well, if you didn't get sick pay, the UK government offers statutory sick pay, which isn't really enough to live off of, but it'll get you your food through the crisis. The government passed laws to stop evictions, and banks offered credit breaks on loans, credit card payments, and mortgages. So far so good, and if your work was forced to close, the government offered a furlough scheme, which was they would cover 80% of the wage. So great, you're covered. You can now afford to self-isolate if need be, and you can afford to stay in lockdown throughout this whole crisis. So right now you might be asking yourself, what's the catch then? Well, evictions are still happening, were still happening, and continued throughout the entire lockdown to keep happening. The government really didn't act all that much. Sadiq Khan caused the tube to be more cramped than ever by restricting the number of services right at the start, and took significant backlash for him to really go back on that. In addition, the money came in very late, so people were stuck without money, without a job, and no way of getting money. In addition, people were breaking lockdown laws, so police were issuing fines. I even saw some videos of multiple vans worth of police drivers coming up to issue one fine, which was very social distancing. On top of all this, there were people like the likes of Mike Ashley, the CEO of House of Fraser and Sports Direct, that insisted his business was essential and thus his workers still had to go in. You need a job to get furloughed from, so House of Fraser and Sports Direct workers continued to go in. Another notable figure was Tim Martin, the owner of Wetherspoons, who told his workers, instead of giving them furlough schemes, to just get another job. For legal reasons, I feel obliged to tell you that both gentlemen very, very quickly retracted their statements and complied with the laws. But I don't think there's anything to do with legal ramifications. I think this is because they thought the British public would remember, and in fact the British public would remember, and COVID wouldn't be the death of their business. Let me just say, I personally think the UK government did a good job at the start. There were logistics issues, sure, but they were cleared up. Should we have gone into lockdown a week earlier? Sure. Was this said at the time? Yes. But I can understand the government's hesitation to commit to a national lockdown. That is a very expensive thing to do after all. So it's the back end of June. What's the country like? Bad. The economy's dead, people are depressed, Netflix is running out of stuff to watch, but it's okay, the 5th of July is just around the corner, so my suspicion is that people will be switching to Disney Plus over Netflix at this point anyway. People have lost loved ones, and at this point are even missing the in-laws. And lastly, no one has any concept of time. Also, at this point, I had been in lockdown for the second time. I suppose that's the joys of living in shared accommodation, where over half of people inside are classified as key workers. This was a 3-day isolation as opposed to a 2-week one, though. At this point we had tests and both came back negative, so I could come back to work pretty quickly. Ironically though, when I did come back, my boss hampered me about taking more time off work because I had too many holidays. So, of course, I took the 5th of July off. What? I wasn't going to throw away my shot? So what did the government do to ease all these issues? Well, they lifted the restrictions a little, allowing, at this point, 2 households to mix. Which, sure, okay, but we still have a significant portion of cases. Sure, it's flattened the curve, but that'll very quickly be undone. This only got exacerbated by the fact that later on they needed to stimulate the economy, so they opened up the whole country effectively to naturally stimulate the economy. What this meant in essence was go out shopping and to restaurants. The latter here got a nice little help out to eat out scheme. In this scheme, the government comped a portion of the bill to try and get people to go out and eat in restaurants again. Rishi, if you're watching this, I actually really like this scheme, but it was done too early. What should have been done instead is an extension of the furlough scheme, allowing the virus to become almost non-existent. Mass usage at this point had become part of normal life, so any small cases that popped up, the NHS would have been able to deal with. Then, in order to balance the books for the amount of extra money you've had to fork over, what you could have done is pushed the burden of sick pay onto the employer by mandating sick pay for all workers. Sure, that's a lot of money that a company now has to fork over to support their workers, but in doing it this way, you would reduce the number of times that they would have to pay out sick leave, because you would have overall decreased the total number of cases, and allowed the economy to open up naturally, encouraging people to spend more money like you did. The country's GDP took a significant hit, but by doing it this way, it would have been almost like an elastic system where it's been pulled and pulled and pulled, but because you're opening the country up in this specific way, it can naturally relax back to its original point. Sure, there would have been damage, but it would have been mitigated by doing it in this way. In addition, you would have even more public confidence because there would be a much lower amount of cases in the country at the time. Therefore, you would significantly increase the number of people who are willing to go out and eat. And don't tell me it's borrowing that you didn't want to do, because the current national debt sits at 100.5% of GDP. So borrowing is clearly something you didn't mind doing. So what has Keir Starmer and Labour been doing through all of this? Well, really, very little. Starmer has been calling the Prime Minister out when he's lying or not providing something, but Johnson has just been ignoring it, because in reality he can. Labour aren't providing any alternatives and are just really being a vocal minority, or bizarrely agreeing with the Conservatives, leaving many Brits confused as to the stance of Labour. A YouGov poll said that 28% of people are unsure how they feel about Keir Starmer, as opposed to Boris Johnson's 8%. Basically, the British public don't know what to think about him. It is worth noting, though, his approval rating is significantly higher than Boris Johnson's, but that might have something to do with my next point. Earlier this month, the government launched their Rethink, Retrain, Reboot campaign, and while I don't know whether this is directly because of COVID, I can't help but notice that this advert came after plays in the West End were being permanently closed, and at a time where art is basically dead outside of the gig economy. It also didn't help that a week earlier Rishi said that people in the arts should consider finding new jobs. This isn't the first time the Conservatives have tried something like this. The Eye reported that this is basically a rehash of an ad from 2019 to promote cybersecurity jobs. I like the idea of the government putting money into new industries. I don't even hate the concept of rethink, retrain, reboot. In the right context, it could be empowering. But using artists as the target audience is nothing short of insensitive. This industry is on life support right now. So you hire a graphic artist to design a poster about leaving the career that they would love, a career that they were encouraged to follow by the government. If this really were about rebooting your career, then there would have been posters from other careers, like scientists or teachers. But you won't see that, because these are both universally respected jobs. The Conservatives have always had their sights trained on the arts. They just finally found the right time to shoot, now that the industry is on its knees. Unemployment in the arts is nothing new, and Statista reports that it has been on the rise in the UK for the last few years. But it's a dream, and that dream comes with risks. It's a risk people are willing to take to entertain people, to make people laugh, to make people cry. Art is work, and while I will mock them relentlessly, I'll always be the first one in line for their shows. And I'll always say that your work is not only valid, but important. And if it weren't for artists, I would have been bored out of my mind throughout this whole lockdown. Hell, I'm listening to music on Spotify while writing this script. Biffy Clyro if you are interested. Art is an extremely big part of our lives. Let's not forget that. In conclusion, lockdowns and the laws surrounding them have been a complete confused mess. They've switched rating systems so many times that it's hard to keep track of what everything means. This, in addition to, well, in a time we're supposed to be social distancing, a van full of police will show up to your house just to issue you a fine or to see if you'd even committed a crime. And now, the public are being faced with the prospect of not being able to see their loved ones throughout the whole of Christmas. We need to work together to get on top of this. Social distance, wash your hands, wear a mask, and wear it right. I don't want to see your noses outside of your masks. Pull them up and pinch the top, make sure that they're tight. And while we're on the topic of being sensible during the lockdowns, if you're a university and you happen to host welcome events or freshers events or really any events that contain a large number of people, maybe reconsider that. Because universities have always been a playground for bacteria and viruses. We used to call them freshers' flus. I used to get one every year while I was at university. The moment new people pile into the university, the numbers of these freshers' flus go up. Except this time, it's not freshers' flu, it's COVID. Freshers' flu can't really kill my grandma. COVID might.